So I want to look longer term and think about the ways in which government can actually create the conditions for future growth when the economy is ready for that. And I'm going to go through, well, depending on time, 5 or 6 different areas I'm just going to touch on. Now, the first one is government. Obviously, I think we need to return to some kind of fiscal responsibility, to fiscal sanity. That can be handled relatively short term over the next 5 years or so. But in the longer term, I think we really need to think quite deeply and fundamentally about the welfare state. Because if we don't put in place really quite radical reforms, I think reforms far more radical than anyone is willing to countenance at this time, we are going to run up against these enormous demographic pressures, and the welfare state is going to be an enormous drain on the productive side of the economy. We need to get ahead of the game there because it's going to come up on us much quicker than we think. Taxes. Yes, we need lower taxes, but I think lower taxes, at least in the short term, are going to be difficult because of the public spending situation that we're in. However, I think simpler taxes, I think taxes with a broader base and taxes with lower rates can boost revenues and probably boost growth as well. I think crucially, though, when you're talking about tax reform, we really need to think about eliminating the distortions that the tax system creates away from saving, away from investment, and away from equity, and towards debt. I think finally we're talking about jobs growth, shifting the burden of taxation off employment, particularly things like employers' national insurance contributions here or social security taxes elsewhere in Europe, things that really raise the cost of employment and make people as employers think, oh, I don't really want to employ anyone else, it's too much of a cost. Third point, regulation. Now, there's a lot of evidence to suggest, actually, maybe this is sacrilege coming from the Adam Smith Institute, that regulation is even more important than tax as an inhibitor on growth. There's some suggestion that if you have a choice between high taxes and low regulation, or low taxes and high regulation, purely in terms of economic growth, actually regulation is the bigger drain on the productive economy. Naturally, I'd like to have both, but I do think we need to look at regulation. And I'm not talking about utilities regulation or financial regulation, but really just the red tape that applies to ordinary, everyday businesses, particularly regulations surrounding employment, which increase the cost of having somebody work for you. The banks. Now, of course, I could probably stand up and talk for half an hour and bore you all to tears about the banks. We all know what a terrible state the financial sector is in. But I think in the long term, the issues with the banking sector do need to be addressed in a fairly radical way if we're going to have this strong return to growth eventually. I probably don't have time to go into the details on that, but I think the long and short of it is that governments all around the world give a risk subsidy to their banking sectors because the banks, the bondholders, the depositors all know that if the banks make bad business decisions, they will be bailed out. People have put numbers on this subsidy. They say it's sort of 10, 15 billion a year, effectively encouraging banks to take on more risk than they would in a free market. Now that is a big problem. Another big problem with the banks for growth is that they have very distorted incentives. Various regulations encourage them, for example, to pile into derivatives rather than more normal assets like business loans or household loans. That's going to be a big issue going forward. I'm going to skip my final point, which was on monetary policy. Basically, I think inflation targeting has had its day and we need to look for alternatives. But the one last thing I'll say is that this actually has to be something of a cultural shift. We have to start living within our means. We have to overcome our addiction to housing. I think we have to start saving again. And crucially, we need to find ways of encouraging entrepreneurship. This all takes time, but it's all possible. Thank you.